The funny thing about revenge is that it tastes even sweeter when served with a dash of paperwork and a side of confusion. After I set up the toll booth and enforced my newly acquired ownership of the access road, it didn't take long for the HOA to start unraveling. The residents were used to Karen's overbearing presence and her so-called community improvements, but when those same improvements started costing them delivery access and construction delays, the tide began to turn. For the first time since she grabbed control of the HOA board like it was her own personal fiefdom, people began questioning whether her decisions were doing more harm than good. The road was quiet on Thursday morning when a cement truck, scheduled to pour a backyard patio for one of the more vocal HOA members, pulled up to the new toll booth. The driver radioed his dispatch and said he wasn't authorized to pay tolls out of pocket. I politely told him to turn around unless someone was willing to cover the cost. The truck left. That same afternoon, Karen showed up at my ranch gate, again, and this time with a stack of printed papers that looked like they'd been rushed through her inkjet printer during a panic attack. She started waving them around like they were arrest warrants, but they were just fake notices threatening me with legal action for obstructing community access. I smiled, told her to have her lawyer call mine, and then calmly walked back to my porch while she yelled things like fraud, scam, and public menace. I didn't react because I knew something she didn't. Earlier that day, I had already spoken with a real estate lawyer, who confirmed that not only was my purchase of the road legally sound, but also the HOA's previous use of the road without a formal easement agreement was now officially considered unauthorized. In simple terms, Karen's entire operation had been built on an assumption, and assumptions don't hold up in court. The cracks began to widen the following day. A landscaping company with a multi-day contract for 5 homes in the HOA community sent a blunt email to the board saying they wouldn't be returning until the toll situation was resolved. Another delivery company sent a bill directly to the HOA for the added mileage and rerouting they had to perform to avoid the access road. A food truck scheduled for a birthday party canceled, and the HOA member hosting the party was furious. The neighborhood Facebook group exploded with passive-aggressive complaints that were barely hiding their rage. But the best post was from a resident who said she overheard her own child asking Alexa why they lived in a neighborhood run by a lady who couldn't even drive straight. Meanwhile, I didn't gloat. I didn't post. I didn't comment. I stayed silent and watched the drama bubble, because nothing speaks louder than watching a self-appointed queen lose her crown one missed Amazon package at a time. Karen wasn't used to losing, so she doubled down. She organized a pop-up rally at the entrance of the road, complete with picket signs, folding chairs, and a Bluetooth speaker playing dramatic violin music. I watched from my porch as 6 or 7 people joined her, though half of them left after realizing there were no refreshments and the sun was brutal. Karen stood there shouting at passing cars and trying to explain how I was holding her community hostage. She even brought up emotional trauma and compared me to a land pirate. Unfortunately for her, the county sheriff passed by that same afternoon. He parked, walked over, and asked her for a permit for public demonstration. When she couldn't provide one, the small crowd was politely but firmly told to pack up and leave. She tried to spin it into a conspiracy, but the damage was done. People began to whisper that maybe she had pushed it too far. Again. Later that evening, I got a surprising visitor. It was one of the HOA board members, a guy named Tim who had mostly kept quiet during Karen's antics. He showed up at my gate, hands up, not in surrender but as a peace offering. I walked out, leaned on the fence, and listened. He told me that several residents were fed up. He admitted that the gate destruction incident had been a huge mistake. One Karen had pushed through without board approval. Apparently, she had claimed I was planning to install surveillance towers on my property aimed at the neighborhood and that the gate was a national security risk. The board didn't believe her, but by the time they figured out she was bluffing, the gate was already in pieces. Tim offered a truce. He asked if I'd consider working out a fixed access plan with the board so that residents wouldn't have to pay tolls every time. I told him I'd consider it, but the first step would be for the board to officially acknowledge their wrongdoing regarding the gate. Until then, tolls stood. He nodded, understanding, and left without argument. I didn't hear from Karen for 2 full days. It was almost suspicious. Then Sunday morning, I saw what she'd been cooking up. A shiny new dirt trail had been carved along the edge of the community, leading through a patch of overgrown brush and into a neighboring lot. Karen had apparently hired a crew to build a temporary bypass to my road. What she failed to realize was that the new path ran directly over a wildlife conservation buffer zone. I called the county environmental office and reported potential land use violations. 2 hours later, a county inspector arrived and halted the construction. Karen showed up and tried to argue, but once the inspector explained the size of the fines she was risking, she backed down. The fake road project was dead. By this point, more residents were reaching out to me, some to apologize, others to beg me to ignore Karen entirely and let them access the road quietly. I was fair. I gave a few of them free access passes for a month and told them I appreciated their honesty. They, in turn, started talking to their neighbors about voting Karen out. The shift was palpable. You could feel the energy in the neighborhood change. Fewer people nodded at Karen. More people stopped by to ask questions about property rights, easement law, and the history of my land. One teenager even stopped me while I was feeding the goats and asked if it was true that I once wrestled a bull for fun. I laughed and said no, but I did outmaneuver a much more dangerous animal, a power-hungry HOA president with a chainsaw. And so the toll booth remained. The road was mine. The silence from Karen wasn't peace. It was the quiet of someone reloading. I knew she'd come back with a new plan, something sneaky, something loud. But I also knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about a gate anymore. This was about power, pride, and pushing back against the kind of entitled tyranny that thinks a clipboard and a bad attitude can replace land rights and common decency. I wasn't just fighting for my gate. I was defending the right to not be bulldozed by a woman who thought she was the sheriff of a cul-de-sac. And the next time she came at me, I was going to be ready. Things really took a turn when the garbage trucks stopped coming altogether. That was the day the residents truly began to understand just how much control I had over that road and how much damage Karen's ego had caused. It started with a group text message from a resident named Kelly, who politely asked if the access road would be open between 9 and 11 so the weekly pickup could be completed. I responded that the garbage trucks were still welcome, as long as the HOA had paid their monthly access invoice. Her reply came with a screenshot of Karen's email to the neighborhood, claiming I had illegally blocked public access and that no resident was to engage or negotiate with me, the land occupier. That was the term she used. Land occupier. Like I was some frontier bandit with a pickaxe and a tent pitched under a wagon. Of course, the real problem was that Karen hadn't paid the invoice. It sat unopened in the HOA's general inbox for over a week, accumulating late fees like fallen leave. I'd even sent a printed copy by registered mail, just to make it official. When the garbage company contacted me directly and I explained the situation, they promptly canceled service to the HOA. Their trucks couldn't risk trespassing on a now privately owned access route. The HOA, which prided itself on spotless yards and pristine sidewalks, began to reek within days. The air was thick with the scent of banana peels, forgotten leftovers, and suburban entitlement. On Wednesday, someone from the board tried to sneak a garbage truck in through a neighboring private trail behind a horse pasture. The truck got stuck in a patch of deep mud and had to be towed out at HOA expense. The pasture owner, furious, reported them for unauthorized access and damage to her fencing. The board had to reimburse her for the repairs, which only added more to the growing financial disaster Karen had created. At this point, I could have ended the whole thing with one phone call, but I didn't. I needed them to see what unhinged leadership looked like when it reached its breaking point. Karen, however, had not given up. Her next move was a desperate one. She attempted to file an emergency injunction to force me to reopen the road, claiming that it was a public necessity. Her lawyer, a guy who looked like he printed his business cards at a library kiosk, showed up at the county office with a stack of papers, half of which were missing signatures. The county clerk, a woman who'd lived in the area long enough to know every land dispute for the last 20 years, called me the moment they left. She said it was the sloppiest filing she'd seen in months. I thanked her and assured her that I had no intention of locking residents out permanently. I just wanted the HOA to be held accountable for once. And then came the board meeting. It was the first one that allowed outside guests, probably because someone on the inside was tired of the closed-door decisions Karen was making. I didn't attend in person, but I had a friend record the whole thing. The room was packed. You could see the tension before anyone even spoke. Karen tried to start with her usual superiority, thanking people for remaining calm during these challenging times. Someone shouted, challenging her to explain why garbage hadn't been picked up in 12 days. Another asked why she'd ignored multiple notices from my side. She tried to dodge the questions, waving papers and citing fake legal references, until finally one board member stood up and said the words everyone was thinking, "You caused this." Karen turned red. Not pink, red. Like a boiled lobster about to burst. She accused the board of conspiring against her, of colluding with me, and of turning their backs on the community. She stormed out halfway through the meeting, her designer heels clicking like gunshots on the tile. The room erupted once she left. My friend later told me the vote to remove her as president was unanimous. Even her allies didn't speak in her defense. She'd finally crossed too many lines, and now the very group she manipulated was slamming the door in her face. The next day, I received an official request from the newly appointed interim president. His name was Jason, a quiet guy who had lived in the neighborhood since before the HOA even existed. He asked if we could negotiate a long-term road access lease for the HOA that wouldn't involve daily tolls or surprise invoices. I invited him over. We sat on my porch, drank sweet tea, and hashed out a basic agreement. They'd pay a monthly maintenance fee for road access, split evenly among the homes, and in return, I'd maintain the road and drop the toll system entirely. It was fair, simple, and honestly something that could have been done months ago if Karen hadn't let her pride ruin everything. But even as things settled down, there was still the matter of Karen. You'd think she'd disappear after being removed from the board, but no. She went rogue. First, she tried to start her own HOA within the community, claiming she had secret support. That lasted exactly one weekend. Then, she started a blog called Gatekeeper Watch, where she posted long, rambling essays about property rights, government conspiracies, and why she believed I was part of an underground network to overthrow suburbia. The posts were so strange that even her former supporters blocked her number. At one point, she attempted to move a trailer onto a patch of land she wrongly believed was abandoned. Turns out it belonged to a retired police officer who didn't appreciate her trying to homestead, 10 feet from his vegetable garden. She was escorted off the property before sunset. Rumors spread that she tried to pitch a reality show idea to a small streaming platform called HOA Nightmares, but they declined, saying it felt more like a horror movie than a documentary. Meanwhile, peace returned to the road. The toll booth was dismantled. I left the signpost up but replaced the sign with one that read Private Road Cooperative Access Only. Residents started waving at me as they passed. Some even dropped off homemade cookies or fresh eggs as thanks. I didn't ask for any of it, but it felt good to be respected again, not because I enforced it, but because I stood my ground when it mattered. What surprised me most wasn't how easily Karen was replaced or how quickly the neighborhood turned on her. It was how many of them had quietly been waiting for someone to stand up to her. People told me stories I hadn't heard before, how she fined a family for having chalk drawings on their sidewalk, How she yelled at a teenager for parking slightly crooked in their own driveway, how she once threatened to report a woman for hanging wind chimes that didn't match the seasonal palette. They weren't just fed up with her. They were afraid of her. Until now. As the sun set on that third week since the gate was destroyed, I stood near the new fence line, looking at the smooth stretch of gravel leading into the neighborhood. No more chaos. No more tolls. Just a clean road and quiet land. I knew Karen would probably try something again, something petty or theatrical. But it didn't matter. Because now the community had seen her without the smoke and mirrors. And once people see the truth, they don't unsee it. She cut down my gate thinking it would end a problem. Instead, it started a reckoning. And for the first time in a long time, it wasn't just me standing on this side of the fence. It was everyone who'd been waiting for someone to say enough is enough. You ever see a grown woman swing a chainsaw at a steel ranch gate like she's auditioning for a horror movie? Well, I did, and her name was Karen. The gate was mine, the land was mine, but that didn't stop her from cutting through it like she owned the whole countryside. She even shouted, "This is HOA property now," as the hinges popped off and my cattle scattered in the background. That moment right there is when I decided I was going to bury this HOA under paperwork, toll booths, and pure poetic justice. It started the week before when I got one of those cheap HOA notices crammed into my mailbox, you know, the type printed in Comic Sans like a joke, and signed with that smug little flourish Karen loves to use. It claimed my ranch gate violated some visual harmony clause and needed to be removed within 48 hours. Now mind you, I don't even belong to their HOA, my land borders it sure, but I've been on this property since before the community even broke ground. I've got deeds, surveys, and a letter from the county stating I'm outside their jurisdiction, but that never stopped Karen before. She'd been trying to rope me into their nonsense for over a year, demanding I paint my barn red to match their fake colonial aesthetic, accusing my goats of being too loud, and even once suggesting my ranch's smell was offensive to her guests during a backyard mimosa party. I ignored it all until that morning, when I stepped outside and found the gate was gone, just flat out gone. The posts were splintered, the metal sheared clean off, and deep tire marks led back toward the HOA community. At first I thought maybe it was an accident, some drunk driver, some wild teen playing demolition derby, but then I saw the trail cam footage. It showed Karen herself, sunglasses on, scarf blowing in the wind, dragging a chainsaw out of her SUV like it was a picnic basket. She had two other HOA board members with her, one filming and the other reading something off a clipboard. They didn't just cut my gate, they held a ceremony like it was some ribbon cutting for a new Starbucks. I called the sheriff, showed him the footage, and you know what he said? He sighed. He actually sighed, like this wasn't the first time she'd pulled something like this, and technically, since she didn't step foot on my side of the property line, he couldn't arrest her for trespass just yet. She'd parked on the public road and reached over. That's when I realized if she wanted to play games with property lines, I could too, and unlike her, I knew exactly where to look. See, my property runs alongside a narrow dirt road that leads straight into the heart of their fancy little gated community. It's the only access in or out unless you're planning to hike a mile through cactus and snakes. That road always fascinated me because no one ever paved it despite the fancy gates and welcome signs. It stayed gravel and dust. Turns out the HOA doesn't own it, they lease it. They've been leasing it from a tiny land trust that went defunct 2 years ago after the original owner passed away, and no one claimed the estate. So I contacted the county clerk, pulled the records, and saw it plain as day. The land, including the road, was up for auction due to unpaid taxes the HOA never paid because they assumed they owned it, just like they assumed they could cut down my gate. Well, within a week I owned that access road for the price of a used lawnmower. But I didn't tell them, not yet. First I had a new gate installed, this one welded steel, double-locked, and anchored deep into reinforced concrete. Karen saw it on her morning walk, and nearly swallowed her organic smoothie whole. She demanded I take it down. I said sure, right after she pays me for the last one plus emotional damages plus replacement fees, and yeah, the sheriff backed me up this time, but that was just the warm-up. Next I ordered a prefab toll booth and a custom sign in big bold letters that said private road access fee applies to all HOA traffic. It arrived on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday it was up and running, complete with solar panels, license plate capture cameras, and a small little card reader. You'd think I was setting up a national border checkpoint. The HOA board flipped. They held an emergency meeting, tried to issue me a cease and desist letter, but it was about as legally valid as a cereal box coupon. Residents started complaining. Fast delivery trucks refused to enter. Contractors walked off the job halfway through. Patio installations, trash pickup delayed 3 days because the company wouldn't pay the fee. Karen tried to drive around the booth using her neighbor's lawn and got stuck in a drainage ditch. She called the fire department claiming it was an emergency. They towed her Lexus out and left mud streaks all over her yoga mat. The best part, one wasn't even charging that much, $10 per car, $25 for trucks, and a one-time free pass for residents who came to me respectfully. But that wasn't enough for Karen. She screamed about corruption, called the mayor, wrote a 6-page rant on the HOA newsletter, and even accused me of running a mafia-style toll operation. She was right about one thing though: I was running things now, not with threats, not with chainsaws, but with receipts, land deeds, and patience. What she never expected was that her little stunt with my gate would lead to her community getting a hard lesson in private road law, and trust me, I was just getting started, because if Karen wanted to wage war over lines, fences, and rules, then she picked the wrong cowboy to mess with, and I was going to make sure every truckload, every landscaper, every Amazon Prime van that entered her neighborhood did so under the banner of my bill. By the end of that week, HOA members weren't asking Karen what to do, they were asking me how to set up their own driveways to avoid the toll. Some even offered to help me install speed bumps or security lights, just to keep things smooth. That gate she cut down was the last time she'd ever get her way without consequences, and the road ahead, well, it belonged to me now, literally and legally. And this was just chapter 1. Karen's silence didn't last long. I knew it wouldn't. The kind of person who marches onto someone else's land with a chainsaw doesn't just walk away after getting dethroned. No, she was regrouping. And sure enough, her next move was even more unhinged than the last. On a crisp Thursday morning, I got a visit from a man in a too-tight suit carrying a bright red folder. He introduced himself as a legal representative for a newly formed group calling itself the HOA Restoration Council. I didn't laugh, though it took effort. He handed me a cease and desist letter claiming I had wrongfully obstructed community infrastructure and was operating an unauthorized toll system. It was Karen, no doubt, trying to repackage herself under a new name and hoping a shinier logo would make people forget the stench she left behind. I read the letter while he waited. It was full of dramatic language and legal jargon, but completely hollow. My lawyer, who was already well versed in this saga, reviewed it within an hour and sent me a memo that boiled down to one sentence: legally meaningless. I didn't respond to the letter. I didn't need to. I let Karen burn energy chasing shadows while I got back to doing what I actually cared about, running my ranch and keeping the peace on that access road. The new HOA president Jason was doing his part too, smoothing things over with residents, quietly cleaning up the administrative mess Karen had left behind, and trying to rebuild trust one fence post at a time. But Karen wasn't just filing letters. She was plotting something big. I found out the hard way 2 days later, when my ranch hand Lucas noticed a drone buzzing around our property. At first, we thought it was just a nosy teenager. But then we saw it again the next day, flying low, hovering over the livestock, dipping just above the barn roof like it was scanning something. On the third day, I finally caught a clear look at the pilot. It was Karen. She was camped out behind some scrubby trees with a folding chair, tablet in hand, directing that drone like she was launching missiles. I confronted her, of course, walked right up to the fence line, and asked what she thought she was doing. She claimed she was documenting land misuse and animal cruelty for an anonymous community audit. I told her to pack up her spy gear and leave before I called the sheriff again. She smirked, as if daring me, and then launched the drone higher, claiming I had no right to airspace above my property. She was wrong about that too. I had already filed for and received a low-altitude drone flight restriction waiver from the FAA months ago when a local documentary crew wanted to shoot aerial footage of my ranch. That waiver was still active. The sheriff showed up after I called, and after reviewing the documents I provided, he ordered Karen to cease all drone activity over my land. She argued, of course, cried foul, said I was harassing her, said I was targeting her freedom to gather information. But the sheriff wasn't new to her nonsense. He gave her one warning and told her if she came back with that drone, she'd be charged with stalking and aerial trespass. That finally got her to leave. But she didn't go quietly. She stormed off shouting that the war wasn't over, only paused. What she didn't know was that she was about to dig her own hole even deeper. A few days later, I got a surprise visit from a woman named Elaine. She was in her 70s, walked with a cane, and had a voice as sharp as barbed wire. She introduced herself as the original founder of the HOA, the woman who had started it back when there were only 6 houses and no fences. She'd stepped away years ago due to health issues and had watched the entire situation unfold from a distance, too tired to interfere, until now. She told me she had seen Karen's behavior grow worse and worse over the years, and that my recent stand had inspired her to act. Elaine handed me a folder. Inside were original HOA bylaws, untouched copies that had never been updated or tampered with. What made this interesting was that Karen's so-called updated rules, about gate height, road access, landscaping uniformity, none of them existed in these documents. Elaine explained that Karen had rewritten the rules without proper vote or documentation and convinced the board to adopt them using bluff, fear, and forged minutes from meetings that never actually occurred. Elaine also had a flash drive with audio recordings from a former board member who had since moved away but recorded meetings out of habit. Those recordings included Karen admitting she bypassed a vote and even bragging that no one reads the paperwork anyway. I couldn't believe it at first. Then I realized this was exactly the sort of corner Karen painted herself into. She wanted power without accountability, and she assumed no one would ever question the fine print. With Elaine's permission, I forwarded the entire package to the new HOA board. Jason was stunned. He called a meeting that same weekend and played the recordings in full. The residents sat in silent disbelief as they heard Karen's voice laughing, mocking them, and making up rules on the spot. One clip had her saying she could cut down that cowboy's gate because nobody would stop her. That was the turning point. By Monday, the HOA had filed formal charges against Karen for document fraud and misuse of community funds. Turns out she'd also been writing herself reimbursement checks for bogus expenses. Lawn consultations, legal retainers, community surveys that never happened. She was done. The board officially revoked her membership, banned her from any future leadership roles, and sent a community-wide notice that her previous edicts were null and void. That night, someone threw a "Karen is gone" barbecue and invited me as guest of honor. I didn't go, but I heard the burgers were good and the mood was better. Even with Karen out, things weren't perfect. Some residents still held grudges. Some were embarrassed they hadn't stood up sooner. Others were just trying to move on without being reminded of the mess. I respected that. I kept to my land, checked the road every morning, kept things quiet. The new access agreement worked. Deliveries resumed. Contractors returned. Life stabilized. Still, I kept a folder of everything Karen had ever done, every message, every forged document, every video. Not because I planned to use it, but because sometimes history needs to be preserved, especially when people try to rewrite it with a chainsaw. I did get one last surprise before the month ended. Karen tried to retaliate one final time by reporting me to the county for operating an unlicensed toll road. Unfortunately for her, not only was the toll booth no longer active, but I'd already filed the access agreement with the county and registered the road as a private easement with conditional usage. The clerk she spoke to recognized the case and handed her a copy of my deed along with a polite suggestion that she cease further action. Witnesses said she tore the paper in half and left muttering about moving to a different county where people respect order. I watched the sunset that evening with a cold drink in hand and the wind gently brushing the grass at the edge of the road. The same road Karen once walked with purpose, believing she ruled it. Now it was quiet, peaceful, and entirely mine. The gate stood tall again, stronger than ever, and no chainsaw was coming near it without consequences. What Karen never understood was that respect can't be demanded. It's earned. And once lost, no title or clipboard can bring it back. The air around the ranch felt different now, like the land itself had exhaled. The road was quiet again, not because it was deserted but because the chaos had finally settled. The tension that had once crackled like electricity between me and the HOA was gone, replaced by something resembling respect, or at the very least mutual understanding. People waved when they drove past. Some even stopped to chat by the fence, asking how the goats were doing or joking about how long it would take before Karen tried to rise from the ashes like a discount phoenix with a clipboard. Peace is a strange thing when you've spent months in conflict. You almost don't trust it. But I chose to embrace it. I focused on the ranch, fixed the last of the fencing, got a new hay shipment delivered without a toll booth argument, and finally had time to rebuild the old barn roof that had been leaning for 2 winters too many. Life was, in the simplest way, good. But even then, Karen wasn't quite done. Her presence lingered like smoke after a bonfire, and as everyone would soon learn, she had one more trick up her sleeve, though this time it didn't go quite the way she planned. It began when I received a call from a local realtor asking if I had any interest in selling my land. It wasn't unusual, developers had been sniffing around for years, hoping to turn pastures into parking lots, but this time the call felt different. The man on the phone was pushy, a little too eager, and he kept mentioning a private investor who was interested in turning the property into a nature park for the community. When I asked who the investor was, he got cagey. That was all I needed to hear. I declined and hung up. 3 days later, another visitor showed up. This time a young man dressed in khakis and a company polo shirt, clipboard in hand and a bright smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He said he was conducting a land use survey, and asked if I'd allow them to take some soil samples. I asked who sent him. He paused, shuffled his papers, and muttered something about a local community beautification initiative. I told him to leave. Before he did, I asked one last question. Was this related to Karen? His face froze. That was all the confirmation I needed. Turns out Karen, despite being banned from the HOA and effectively blacklisted by most of the neighborhood, had been working on a backdoor plan to buy up adjacent land under fake names and shell companies. Her goal was to create an access route that bypassed my road entirely and allowed her to claim independence from my easement agreement. She thought that if she could isolate my property and surround it with her new green corridor, she could paint me as the one causing division, then strong-arm the county into seizing a portion of my land for public access. The flaw in her plan was twofold. First, she didn't have the money. Second, she didn't realize that one of the parcels she was eyeing belonged to an old friend of mine, a Vietnam vet named Carl who had lived on the edge of town longer than both of us combined. Carl called me the moment her representative showed up offering him twice market value in cash. When he asked who the buyer was, they told him it was confidential. Carl might be old, but he wasn't stupid. He politely refused, then immediately called me and offered to lease me the land for $1 a year, just to keep it out of her reach. I accepted on the spot. With Carl's land now under my care, Karen's plan was dead in the water. But the real nail in the coffin came from within her own former community. The HOA board, now fully recovered from the chaos she'd created, had quietly been compiling a record of every stunt she'd pulled, from the forged bylaws to the fake invoices to the unauthorized drone flights. Jason, the new president, had forwarded the entire file to the county, and what they found was enough to open an official investigation into fraudulent HOA practices. Karen was served papers one Tuesday afternoon. A deputy delivered them to her temporary rental home across town, where she'd been staying ever since being evicted from her old place due to unpaid HOA fees and a lawsuit from a neighbor she'd slandered online. Witnesses said she slammed the door in the deputy's face, only to open it seconds later and beg him not to tell the media. Too late. A small local paper had already picked up the story, and while it didn't go national, it certainly went viral in every community board within a 100-mile radius. After that, she vanished. Not literally, but socially. No more blog posts. No more rallies. No more email blasts filled with misspelled legal threat. It was as if the storm had finally exhausted itself. Her voice faded out, and what remained was the quiet rebuilding of a community that had nearly torn itself apart because one woman thought she was above the law. I spent the next week making changes on my end too. I tore down the old toll booth and replaced it with a small wooden archway carved by a local artist. It read "Welcome to the Boundary Road." Beneath it hung a sign with a list of 3 simple rules: respect the land, respect the people, and no chainsaws allowed. Most people got the joke. A few even asked if they could take selfies under the sign. I didn't mind. Let them. It was a reminder that even chaos could lead to clarity, and that sometimes the best fences weren't built out of spite but out of hard-earned wisdom. And then came the most unexpected moment of all. A letter. Not from Karen, but from a high school student who lived in the HOA. She'd been following the entire situation and wrote to thank me for standing up for what was right. She said she wanted to study law one day, maybe even specialize in property rights, and that watching the whole story unfold had inspired her more than anything she'd seen in a textbook. That letter meant more than any of the victories I'd claimed. Because while revenge might have been the spark, resolution had become the fire that warmed the community back to life. The ranch, the road, and the people all found their rhythm again. Kids rode their bikes along the access path without worry. Delivery trucks came and went without tolls or confusion. Neighbors waved. I waved back. The gate stood tall, strong, and unchallenged. Not because it was invincible, but because now everyone knew what it stood for. As for Karen, I heard a rumor she moved 2 towns over and tried to join another HOA. That one, however, did its research. Her application was denied before she even finished her first sentence. Sometimes the past has a way of catching up, no matter how far you try to run. So that's how it ended. Not with a courtroom brawl or another chainsaw showdown, but with a handshake, a wooden sign, and a ranch that stayed exactly where it belonged. Home.